have questions on what she just went over?
I've got a question. Have you heard of Foundation of American Christian Education, the FACE program that teaches critical approach? I'd really like for you guys to look into that because it's conflicting a little bit with what you're saying, but yet it really strongly enhances the Christian history of America.
How does it conflict?
Is that my work?
Well,
Yeah, I'll restate our problem because I'm familiar. They're talking about FACE. You can stay there, Nina. The Foundation for Christian Education and their materials where they really emphasize that we are a Christian nation and the Christian history. And she was saying some of your data conflicts with what they would say. So you want to address, but if you don't know what they say, it'd be hard for you to address it.
Well, I can address it a little bit, even though I don't know what they say. Certainly,
We're good at that. We're Americans.
in total truth, I am drawing out certain data and highlighting it. I'm not giving a comprehensive view of Christian history. I'm not a historian per se, so I'm not giving you a history textbook. I am highlighting those elements that contributed to the loss of a Christian mind. And so they may not be elements that, they probably are pulling out completely different elements and highlighting them to emphasize the very positive impact that Christianity had on American culture. And that's true. So I am, but if we're going to address the problem of having lost a Christian mind, and I think Classical Conversations is one of the best organizations that's out there promoting and teaching how to have a Christian mind, one of the things you guys are up against is why don't people recognize the need for this? How can we persuade people that they need this? And the way you do that is you have to get inside their mind, understand what the barriers are, and these inherited patterns of thought that are often unconscious. And so we have to recognize what those are if we're going to be effective in overcoming those barriers. So I have gone, it's kind of a diagnostic thing. Get inside and pull out those unconscious patterns of thought. Show us where they came from. I found that if you look at the historical development, you can see it much better. You can see the unfolding of this this disrespect of things of the mind, this emphasis on just the heart versus the head. And then you can address it better and help people to see the need for something like Classical Conversations.
So let's see a lot of where we are politically as a nation, and a lot of their curriculum will discuss some of the forerunners of individual thought, which is what we're covering now. But then why as a nation we have reduced Christianity. And, I'm overwhelmed a little bit because I'm helping my son with the American government.
I'll repeat what she's saying.
So it's becoming very unique.
I know. I'm going to repeat it. Yeah, you can sit down there. And give the mic. Yeah, give.
Thank you.
With this light, we have
I'm
to
just trying to, is this on?
You have to turn it on.
I don't think it is. But I was just trying to understand how it's not, it is. I'm just too soft. I'm just trying to understand in the political realm. Now it's on. Okay.
Trying to understand in the political realm where we are as a nation, where we're headed as a nation. And so FACE teaches you about inductive thinking with some of the authors of that time. And it's almost overwhelming for me to really get a grasp on understanding where they're coming from. They cover a lot of classic literature as well, but they're pulling individuals like Washington, like Locke, like Wickfield, into the program to understand why we were stronger as a nation before the American Revolution of standing up for Christianity. I mean, I know it's a roundabout question.
Well, certainly America was founded on, kind of a blend of Christian and Enlightenment thinking. And you can, in the 1960s, the Enlightenment won. The seculars, essentially, they've been kind of battling back and forth, and if you go back historically, you can emphasize the Christian elements, and then, of course, our secular writers say, no, we were secular from the beginning because there's the Enlightenment element. And the two have been kind of in tug of war all through American history. And basically, the reason society has become so secularized today is that the Enlightenment is now winning.
Yeah, and one thing I thought was maybe need some clarity from your talk is you gave those charts at the beginning that showed the progression, and then you actually made the comment that there were no atheists back then. And, right, which was a contradiction to the charts. And I think that something to be clear is that just because you're not a committed believer and a follower of Jesus Christ doesn't mean that you don't get that that's the capital, the culture, the values around you. And I don't know, can you, like...
Yeah, good point. The chart was specifically a religious adherence. Okay, so that's member of a church. One reason the numbers were so low at the beginning is that the requirements for membership were much more strenuous. And there were places where there was no church. Yes, you couldn't be a member of the church if it wasn't there. But even taking that into account, it was a lot lower than the typical stereotype. But I think your point is well taken, that these are members of a church. People who were not necessarily affiliated with a church back then still tended to have a highly Christianized mind, in the sense of many of them, of course, believed in a God, even if it wasn't saving faith. They basically held Christian morality, Christian understanding. Even, I mean, this is up until my parents' generation. Up until very recently, Christians didn't really stand out that much from their culture. With my parents' generation, it was go to church on Sunday and the rest of the week just be respectable. Because they didn't have that sense of standing out from the culture, whereas today, you have a profound sense of standing out from our culture. So that was a good point.
Thank you. It's so interesting, all of it. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about the temperance movement. It just kind of triggered if that had any impact and what you thought about that.
Well, in total truth, I have a whole chapter on women and what should I pull out? What should I pull out? I have a whole chapter on how women became, in the 19th century, in many ways, they were the ones who fueled a tremendous number of voluntary associations, Sunday school movement and charities and feeding the poor and helping feeding the hungry and helping the poor. And the temperance movement was part of that. It was such a huge movement that historians call it the benevolent empire. The benevolent empire. And it was largely fueled and manned by women. So it was part of women fighting back against the secularization of culture. You know, the public sphere was becoming secularized far earlier than the private sphere. So business, industry, politics, academia were becoming secularized. And women, in a sense, were fighting back. They were trying to bring Christian values and family values, as we now call them, back out into the public arena. And so one of them was fighting against the effects of alcoholism. And most of their arguments were, the man who drinks is taking money from his kids. So it was certainly a major part of fighting back against the secularization of society.
I had a question about the two challenges you said during the 19th century. One was Darwinism, but I didn't hear what the second one was, and if you could explain that one.
Good. Higher criticism. Higher criticism was his Bible criticism. In other words, it started with Hegel. Hegel was the first evolutionary thinker. Evolution did not start with Darwin. It started with Hegel, 200 years before Darwin. And it started not as a biological theory, that was just the final puzzle piece. It started out as a theory of the evolution of culture. And Hegel taught a kind of pantheism where God was not the creator of the world, but a mind, absolute mind or spirit within the world. And it unfolded historically over time. Well, what did that mean? That meant that any particular society represented the absolute mind at that stage of the evolution of consciousness. And so each stage of history was shaped by the evolution of the mind, from simple to complex. Therefore, everything had to be explained in an evolutionary pattern from simple to complex, not just culture, so ideas, laws, customs, morality, and religion. And so people set about deciding what the stages of religion were. Okay, what's the simplest stage of religion? Well, what do you think? Animism. Okay, animism, that seems primitive and simple, right? Animism and totemism were the simplest stages, and that went to, what would be the next stage? Polytheism, right. And the next stage is called henotheism, which is one main god, like Zeus on Mount Olympus. And the next stage would be, finally we get to monotheism. And then the final stage is what's called ethical monotheism. It's where God is not only one God, but God is holy and demands holiness of us. So then they took this series of the evolution of religion to the Bible and said, does it fit? No. The Bible has ethical monotheism from Genesis 1 on. Well, that just proves that the Bible is full of errors and mistakes, because it doesn't fit my schema. And so they took scissors and paste and started rearranging it, and anything that seemed primitive, like God being angry, was obviously early, and anything that seemed high and exalted and sophisticated was later. So this was the beginning of biblical criticism. It was totally an armchair theory. As soon as archaeology was birthed as modern science, it promptly started undermining all of the critical theories. But it had tremendous impact until then. The idea that we can decide, we can decide what historical sequence should be in the Bible. The Bible doesn't have it, therefore the Bible is wrong. So the liberalism began to undermine belief in Scripture. And this was primarily in Germany, and it was coming across to the United States. And this was the big challenge that came at the end of the 19th century, the beginning of historical criticism of the Bible.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's a good segue into the soul of science, because what Nancy's basically done in this book is set up a number of the predominant worldviews, explain them, and given examples of how they've influenced history, and then today even influence the way we think. I'm thinking more about the mechanistic worldview, the organistic worldview, the progressive worldview, and in fact, your history showed very much to me, and I may be mistaken, but that the church has bought into a progressive worldview, that we need to get rid of the rubbish and move on to our own thing. So maybe for our audience, define some of the main categories of worldview, and then we can go more towards the answer that you're looking for, or the discussion.
Yeah, in Soul of Science, I show how, well, the main point of Soul of Science is to show the impact, the interplay between Christianity and science from the time of the scientific revolution, and to show how great an impact Christianity had. Like the earlier comment on how great an impact we've had politically, most of us don't realize just how much impact it's had on science. And many people don't even know how much key figures, I start out with the story of a young woman who was in the honors program at UCLA, head of the campus crusade there, and I thought it was going to be a very intelligent, bright young woman. I said, I'm writing a book on how people like Newton were Christians. She said, Newton? Newton was a Christian? I thought, okay, this is why we need this book. So it goes through various fields of science, biology, mathematics, physics, and so on, and shows the impact that Christian thought had on the foundations of the field. What was interesting to me was to find out that most of the conflicts within science roughly until Darwin. Darwin was when science really took the secularizing turn. Up until then, for 300 years, most of the conflicts in science were not between science and religion. That's what we usually think. It's the science-faith issues. They weren't science-faith issues. They were between different Christians who had different philosophies of nature. People had different understandings of what our philosophy of nature ought to be as a Christian. So, for example, as we know, the first one coming out of the Middle Ages would be Aristotle, right? Aquinas takes Aristotle and sort of Christianizes that. So the first philosophy that many people brought into their science was Aristotelianism. And they looked at nature the way Aristotle taught them to. It was a teleological view of nature. Teleology means driven by a purpose or a goal. Obviously, even before the rise of modern genetics, it was clear that there must be some directing principle that makes sure that the egg becomes a chicken and not an eagle. Oh, wait, that's still an egg. A chicken and not a frog. Or that the acorn becomes an oak tree. Something is directing it, because the acorn always becomes an oak tree. And so for Aristotle, that was the key to all organic, or all natural processes. They must all have an end, a built-in end that they're tending toward. And for a lot of Christians, that seemed like, well, God's purposes in nature. So that seemed very compatible with the Christian concept of nature. And there were many early modern scientists who were Aristotelians. And of course, because that model was taken from biology, it was especially the early biologists who tended to be Christian Aristotelians. The competing worldview at that time was Neoplatonism. That was not exactly from Plato. Neoplatonism was an adaptation of Plato that included even some Eastern thought coming over from Persia at the time. It was kind of the New Age movement of the ancient world because it combined East and West. But Neoplatonism had a very different view of nature. It was sort of pantheistic. It emphasized the spiritual forces within nature. And many Christians thought, well, that's, God's immanent power in nature. God's spirit is in nature. We can adapt some Neoplatonic thought. And so the Neoplatonists tend to be especially in chemistry, for example, where the very term active principles, you take your medicine jar and it says active principles. Well, those active principles were the spiritual forces within nature. That's where that term came from. Or when people worked with distilling, and they found out that you could get alcohol. And the old-fashioned term for alcohol was spirits. Why would they call it spirits? Because they really thought that was the spiritual force within nature that you were capturing. So there were a lot of Christian Neoplatonists. And then really beginning, when Archimedes was rediscovered, the Renaissance was a gradual rediscovery of these ancient sources. When Archimedes was rediscovered, you had Christians who became mechanists. The world is a great machine. This is especially Galileo. And they thought, well, God created, just like a machine, just like a watch or any other machine, has to have a maker, has to have an inventor, a designer. So to call the world a machine is to acknowledge God as the one who invented it, designed it, and wound it up. And so a lot of Christians thought of a mechanistic idea. My elbow's a hinge. My heart is a pump. So they thought there's no problem with having a mechanistic view that can be Christian. So there were really these three groups primarily of Christians who were sort of vying with one another and arguing with one another. And most of the debates within the history of science are debates between these different Christian groups. It's not a faith versus science. It was Christians versus other Christians over the correct philosophy of nature.
Okay, so really one of the places...
Yeah,
down.
my turn.
Yeah, I wish I was holding mine so you could drink it. I'll get it in a second. So the place where I'm seeing that practically is a homeschooling parent of, say, an older child or a classically educated, a family classical education, who is really upset that a certain author is in the works of the reading list at the school they attend or in classical conversations or any of the other programs are out there. And so they'll be on the forums emailing about how this person's not a real Christian or they're not Orthodox or whatever the issue happens to be. And yet at the same time will come to me upset that I don't have a pure geometry course. And I sit there and I think, okay, why do you accept Euclid with no questions, but you don't accept a Christian who's trying to think differently? Secularism has allowed us to buy into pagan ideas or pagan origination of ideas and not question it. And yet these little nuances within our own body tear us apart. And I think it comes from this worldview that science is right, it's a fact, it's what should be taught, it's pure. And the way that we interpret Scripture is going to always be wrong, and we, are going to always have arguments over it. And so, can you address that? I mean, why do we buy science the way that we do, and what about our worldview that makes that happen?
Yeah, what you're saying is that the Christians have bought into what is called the fact-value split. Mm-hmm. The fact-value split is a term that came out of the social sciences. It was when the social sciences decided they had to be scientific. They weren't called the social sciences before that. How would the social sciences become truly scientific? And they said, well, the way to do it is we have to get rid of whatever you can't detect empirically, whatever you can't see, hear, weigh, and measure. Okay? Whatever cannot be detected by empirical methods is not truly scientific. Well, at that point in the social sciences, they were still looking at things like what makes a just society? Is justice something you can see, weigh, hear, or measure? No, it's an abstract concept. You know, they were looking at how do we establish the common good? Is goodness something you can see, hear, weigh, or measure? In other words, all the moral evaluations that until then, sociology was thought to be the science of what makes for a good society. They started saying we cannot, if anything that can't be detected by empirical measures is merely subjective, private, personal preferences. In order to be truly scientific, we have to relegate that to the realm of personal preference, and we will deal only with what is empirically detectable. So that this is the beginning of what was called the fact-value split. On the level of facts, that's objective, that's universally valid, we all have to accept that. But on the level of morality, theology, those are personal values, which literally meant whatever I or my group values. See, when we as Christians, you hear people talk about defending our Christian values, what we don't realize is that we're shooting ourselves in the foot when we do that, because to the secular person, values is inherently relativistic. Values means this is what I value. And they'll turn around and say to us, well, why should you impose your values on us? Well, you can see why they say that now. If by definition, values are private, personal preferences. Of course you shouldn't be imposing your preferences. If I said, you like chocolate and I like vanilla, I said, no, you have to like what I like. I said, that's oppressive. That's not respecting the other person. Isn't this the language we hear when we talk about Christian values? Because the word values has come to mean your group can have their preferences, and your group can have yours, and your group can have yours, as long as we recognize that none of them is objectively true. And I think that even in the Christian world, we tend to fall into that as well.
So I had this idea in my mind, and maybe I was taught this, and I'd like to get your feedback on it, that it was Galileo and Copernicus and the response of the church to their discoveries. It kind of, in my mind, kind of kicks off this idea of the combat between the church and science. And I don't know when I was taught that or what. Could you
And
comment
she has
on
a whole
that?
chapter on that in this Soul of Science. So why don't you tell the true Galileo story?
I'll emphasize, you asked about Kepler and Copernicus and so on. We were going to have a brief slideshow to kick off, and I answered some of that in the slideshow. We'll end with that instead, but I don't have Galileo, so I'll give you Galileo. Galileo. It's something that's dear to your heart. Galileo was essentially arguing for a mathematical view of nature. This was the heart of the issue. At that point, a sun-centered system, a heliocentric system as opposed to a geocentric system. At that time, there was not really enough empirical evidence to decide between them. They made no difference practically. The main use of the stars was for navigation, and it made no difference for navigation. So it made no practical difference. It made no scientific difference, just because there wasn't enough empirical evidence. You didn't have the parallax yet. Parallax is when the stars seem to shift if you're on different sides of the Earth. You didn't have parallax yet. You couldn't detect it. We didn't have good enough telescopes to detect it. There was really no way to decide between them empirically, scientifically. So the only thing that was really different between them was the geocentric system tended to fit within the Aristotelian view of science, and Galileo's arguments and Copernicus' arguments as well, for a heliocentric system were primarily mathematical. So the question was, is nature primarily Aristotelian or mathematical? That was the real issue. And see, for the Aristotelian, the main things, what are the four elements in Aristotle? Earth, air, air, fire, water. Anyway, the four elements, and everything was explained by quality, not quantity. Heat and cold, soft and hot, soft and hard. Qualities were what really counted in the Aristotelian science. Mathematics was way low on the list. That was not an important part of what made nature what it is. In fact, there was a quote that I think I have it in, maybe it's in Saving Leonardo, but there was a quote from one of the Aristotelian philosophers of the day arguing against Galileo, and he said, for anyone to think you can establish scientific or natural facts by use of mathematics is totally demented. For the two are very different. That was the attitude of the Aristotelians. You're trying to prove something by math alone? Nature isn't mathematical, right? So, and Galileo was saying, no, nature is mathematical. So it was really a debate between the Aristotelian view of nature and a mathematical view of nature. And so his main opponents were actually not churchmen. It was really not the church. It was primarily the Aristotelian philosophers in the universities who really opposed him. So why did the Pope then put him under house arrest? Well, that had more to do with personal issues. Did you know that the Pope, when he was a cardinal, was a member of there's a circle of, Galileo was one of the early science celebrities. He had his own fan club. They called themselves the Galileisti, and they were, Galileo's fan club. And the Pope, when he was a cardinal, was a member of this club. So they had been very, very good friends. But when he became Pope, Galileo wrote a little pamphlet in which he had a debate, between hypothetical people over his theory. And one of the people was called Simplicio, which meant simple-minded. And he put some of the Pope's words into the mouth of Simplicio. In other words, this is not the way to make friends and influence people. It's to essentially call your former friend a simple-minded person, and to publish this. In fact, Galileo, we have now found a document where Galileo says, I know why I got put under house arrest. I made fun of His Holiness. Direct quote, I made fun of His Holiness. And Galileo ought to know. If that's the true reason, he ought to be he's the primary source here. And that's what he says. He said, it's because I made fun of him. I know why he got back at me. It's because I attacked him publicly. So there were a lot of things going on. And there were other things going on. Sociologically, the Catholic Church had just reaffirmed its commitment to Aristotelianism over against the Protestant Reformation. So Galileo was seen as giving aid and comfort to the enemy. In addition, Galileo published not in Latin, but in Italian. What was that all about? The elites, the intellectual elites, still published in Latin. There was as science was rising, science rose primarily outside the universities. There was a competing group of intellectuals now rising up outside the universities, and Galileo, by publishing the vernacular, was addressing them and empowering them. So there was sociological tensions. There was a lot going on. But I like Galileo's account. I made fun of His Holiness.
And I think all this conversation is getting directed to this gentleman's comments and questions. How much within our church circles, our homeschooling circles, are we arguing over where these worldviews come from and have the intellectual ability to use the vocabulary that she's using to know the fundamental arguments behind the questions that we're trying to ask, let alone the questions even? And the point, I think, towards the Quadrivium, the classical model, the recovering the use of words, and now hopefully recovering the proper use of science and math, will get us to the point where in Sunday schools, we can have conversations on whose philosophy is really driving our decision to have geometry in 8th grade instead of 12th grade, or Euclidean geometry instead of Gaussian geometry, or Laplacian, and do you even know who those people are and which their mathematical fields they support? We need to, as Christians, take back from the secularists the ideas, the thoughts that are forming our culture. So, is that where we're going, you think?
I like that. See, that's the theme of the soul of science was, hey, This is our history.
Yeah.
Once you realize how much the rise of modern science was saturated with Christian conceptions about nature and creation and so on, you realize this is our history. Why have we let the secularists take it away from us? Why have we let the history textbooks, strip away so much of the theological motivation of all of the early modern scientists, and essentially treated that as though, okay, that's a secular field. There's theology and then there's math and science. It's not secular. This is our insights. This is our history. We need to reclaim it.
I love a lot of the things that you're saying, specifically about the fact that you brought it back to creation, math but one of the things that I have a conflict even is I'm only 2 years in classical conversations, and I've been trained in the principal approach with the face, is that why is it that we're always going back to the Greeks instead of, like you did, you went straight to Scripture and said, in creation we see these subjects and information. I understand the need to know history and take back the history, and I love what you said, Lee, at the beginning was about, you wanted to educate your children for the kingdom. You're not here just for your family, but for the kingdom, and I think that answers that man's question as well. We want to master these things for the kingdom, but the thing that I've been struggling with, I guess, is that we tend to take back things to the Greeks when, even in your response, you went to the Word, to creation. We actually just did a trip. My husband and I came back, and my children went to Greece and Turkey, and we had an encounter there where they were talking about health, and they took us to the health spas of the day. I forget the Greek word, but it's where if you were sick, you went to it. And there's the symbol of the snake, and she asked, where did that come from? And my son said, what? Moses, and she said, oh no, it went to this Greek guy. And, she went back to the Greeks, and I had this conflict of, no, the Bible is first. And so I feel a struggle in me of going back to the Greek when I want to jump to the Word, and you did it in your answer and said, we go to creation. That's where we're supposed to go because every subject is there. So anyway, that's my question.
Yeah, well, first, praise God for the struggle in your spirit and for thinking and knowing that there are different places these ideas came from, and not just accepting because somebody told you something. And I get like that same issue when people will say, the Pythagoreans discovered pi, and I'm like, no, the Hebrews knew it centuries ahead of time in 1 Kings 7:23. The problem is we don't know our scriptures well enough to know what the Greeks contributed to and what we knew ahead of time. So studying our scriptures is incredibly important, and it is where we begin. But you also can't study the scriptures if you don't know Greek and Roman history. It's impossible to read the New Testament and know the allusions, the metaphors, the meanings. For instance, when we say, in him we move and have our meaning, that's a poem to Zeus. So you have to teach your children who Zeus is and who Paul was talking to. If you look at the names of the figureheads on the ship that Paul used to travel across the Mediterranean, they were modeled after Greek gods. Those names and references are all through Scripture. We need all of it. We need the Scriptures. We need the stuff Face is talking about. They didn't know, Face has a really wonderful emphasis on the Christian heritage that our country has, and really loves to dig into why we have that and what Christian capital we received from that. So those ideas are important. The Greeks and Romans are important. The Hebrews are important. You're important. And the thing is, we need to give our children the ability to not be swallowed up by the tide of the moment they live in, but to take truth and knowledge from all the various areas, and even when it's not true. Say, that's why they believe that. And so I'm not going to believe that. And so I think that we've referenced, a variety of places, but classical education right now, there are whole Christian groups that really do emphasize the Greeks and Romans over the Hebrews. There's those groups that emphasize the Hebrews over the Greeks and Romans. We all need to be part of a conversation and keep asking these questions. God loves the Christians in Korea and in the middle of Africa as much as he ever loved any Roman or you and I, and it's all important. I'm going to share that again.
It was very helpful to me in the book, pages 20 and 21, where you had the first and second story, so it was a vertical line there rather than you're using your hands now for horizontal. And so to see how the culture really does look at it as what is objectifiable and what is more hard-based.
Yeah, in the book, I use a little diagram. Actually, many scholars have used that little diagram. It became known in the Christian world through Francis Schaeffer, but it turns out that many scholars talk about a two-story universe. A concept of truth has divided into two stories. On the lower story is the facts, empirical facts, which everyone can know, which are objective, which you need to accept whether you like it or not because that's true. Whereas the upper story, the two stories in a building, the upper story is private, personal. You keep it to yourself. You have your right to believe whatever you want to as long as you don't bring it to the public square.
I want to ask a question before I ask one of you for another one. There's a couple of chapters here in math, and one in particular is called The Idol's Fall. You asked me to kind of... The Idol's Fall, Non-Euclidean Geometry, and the Revolution in Mathematics. Can you kind of share that with us? It's a talk that I'm kind of working on, where I want to relay to people how we think of math as being this very specific, very almost narrow body of information, and we don't realize that among the mathematicians, there's various ways of measurement and philosophies and even theologies of why math is the way it is, and you kind of address that in your book. And the whole idea of Euclid being kind of the standard of how to develop any kind of scientific philosophy, and then all of a sudden he falls in the last century. So just tell them that story for me.
It might be easier to do it historically. For the ancient Greeks, mathematics was, ideal. The truths of mathematics resided in kind of an ideal realm. There was an ideal realm where we had justice, goodness, truth, abstract concepts like that, and mathematical truths were in that ideal realm. These were eternal, these were unchanging. These were separate from the material world, which was changing, the realm of decay and corruption and death. Obviously this realm had nothing to do with this realm. So Euclid and Pythagoras taught mathematical truths, but they did not really believe that mathematical truths were instantiated in the material realm. I was on a radio program once for solar science, and with a secular host, and he says, well, you're saying that Christianity, was the source of modern science, that it influenced the rise of modern science. He said, well, what about Pythagoras and Euclid? Weren't these pre-Christian influences? I said, yes, you're right. They were pre-Christian influences, but they were not enough to start modern science, because for them, mathematical truths are isolated up in this Platonic heaven of ideal truths and abstract concepts. They have nothing to do with this world. It's changing, evolving. They didn't believe in evolution. It's changing, it's more like decay and corruption. They did not believe that mathematical truths were instantiated in the material realm. That came about with Christianity, when Christians started taking the insights of the Greeks, but saying, wait a minute, it's not a separate Platonic heaven. These are ideas in God's mind. Abstract concepts like truth and justice and mathematical truths are the truths that God knows, and they're the templates, they're the patterns that he used when he created the universe. And so, yes, mathematical ideals and truths are instantiated in the material realm, because that's the pattern God used when he created the world. So it took the Christian concept of creation to give people the confidence that they could go out in nature and find mathematically precise relationships, mathematical formulas. And of course, the person who really convinced them was Newton. Newton was the first person. Can you imagine? Up until then, nobody thought you could have one mathematical formula that combined the orbits of the planets with the fall of the apple on his head, according to legend, or the arc of a cannonball. A vast variety of different processes in nature are suddenly all explained by F equals ma. What? What? You've captured the vast, different processes that happen all in the universe in one tiny little mathematical formula? This was astonishing. This was amazing. So, but then that led to the next stage, which was the secularization of mathematics, when people started saying, hey, well, this is so amazing, who needs God for it? Now that we've got the tool of mathematics, we can solve our problems. We can control nature. We can create whatever we want in terms of our technology. So people began to say, people take God's gifts and run with it, right? They took God's gift of mathematics and ran with it and said, well, mathematical structure is just built into nature. You don't need to explain that. The human mind can know mathematical processes. We don't need to believe that we're made in the image of God in order to support our confidence in the human mind. And then they turned around and figured out they didn't have a basis. And that's when the idol fell. And today, mathematicians do not speak of mathematics as being true. After all, if my brain evolved by undirected material forces, why should what happens in here have anything to do with the reality of the objective structure of the universe? Why should it? I mean, as Darwin himself used to say, if my brain evolved from a monkey's mind, why should I give it any credibility? He called it his horrid doubt. He said the horrid doubt arises within me whether a brain that's evolved from a monkey's brain should be trusted. So today, mathematicians treat math as just a game. It's internally consistent like the game of chess. It's internally consistent, it has its own rules, but it has nothing to do with the real world. We cannot say, there was one mathematical philosopher named Eugene Wigner, and he wrote a very famous essay called The Unreasonable Effectiveness of Mathematics. And it's frequently quoted because he raises the issues of why is it that the theorems, the ideas that we come up in this human brain fit so well with the external world. Why should it be? It's unreasonable. On purely secular materialistic premises, it is unreasonable. There's no basis for it. I kind of think he might have been a Christian. He kind of hints that we really need a different basis. If the universe is created by a mind, and we're created in the image of that mind, then it makes perfect sense. But if we're kicked up out of the dirt by blind material forces, then it makes no sense at all. So the current philosophies of mathematics all treat it as simply a game that we play, like chess or like baseball, that has no relation to the real world.
Why do you think that mathematics, the history that you gave us, you didn't really talk about math, you were talking about overall ideas, but specifically math. Initially, it was in the seminars, the sciences, not seminars, in the universities, math and sciences. Why do we not have seminaries without any math and science in them? How did that happen?
Oh, seminaries.
Yeah. Because initially they all had it.
I think historically it's because it's the seminaries that were kicked out. Seminaries, when Harvard and Yale and Dartmouth at Princeton were all started, the seminary was right, there wasn't a separate seminary. It was right in the middle of the university. Theology was the queen of the sciences. So theology was seen as central to all the fields. And one of the first steps in secularization was when theology department got shifted over to the side and put in a separate, that's something called a seminary. Separate, when Princeton, now we have Princeton University and we have Princeton Seminary. When did they get separated and why? That was the beginning of when it was the fact-value split. Oh, in the university we deal with facts. Theology, well, that's just values. Take that out over to the side. So that was the institutional expression of the fact-value split, is when theology got split off institutionally from the rest of the university, shunted over on the side, said, well, that's some kind of specialized knowledge for people who care about that kind of thing. But it's not part of knowledge that everyone needs to know. So in the seminaries, why did they let that happen is what we should be asking.
Yes.
Why did the seminaries let that happen? Why did they say, oh, well, they meekly went over and said, oh, fine, as long as you let us still have a spot, we'll go be in a separate little ghetto. That is the mentality that we're still fighting against when in classical conversations you're trying to bring theology back to the center and say, if God exists, that's the foundation of all of our knowledge in every field of academic study. By the way, we originally had short PowerPoint slides to kick off, so we could end with that if we want. See, the problem is that history History has been written, especially the history of science, has been written as a secular morality tale. History was founded as a modern discipline by Enlightenment figures like Voltaire, Gibbon, and David Hume. And they all had a very specific agenda. They wanted to discredit Christianity by painting the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages are the Dark Ages. They're the ones who invented that term. It was the Dark Ages, a time of ignorance and superstition. Historian Carl Becker puts it this way. This was the function of the new history, the new modern form of history, to show that the Dark Ages of human experience were precisely those when men were most dominated by the Christian church. So Carl Becker himself was no friend of Christianity, but at least he acknowledges that these early modern histories were never intended as objective, fact-based accounts. They were written to advance a philosophical agenda. They were written to promote rationalism and secularism. The history of science would serve as a morality tale of enlightenment and progress. There's a sociologist of religion named Rodney Stark who puts it in particularly strong terms. He says, the Enlightenment was conceived initially as a propaganda ploy by militant atheists and humanists who attempted to claim credit for the rise of science. Now, Rodney Stark was not a Christian either, but he says that he quoted Andrew Dixon White in his early professional writings, thinking he was a valid authority. So he is particularly outraged that people are not being informed, that he was not informed that many of these myths have been debunked. And so that's why it's crucial to teach our children about science, not just as a collection of facts about the natural world. In other words, not just the facts of biology and physics and chemistry. It's just as important to teach them how science is used for polemical purposes to discredit Christianity. And this is another reason that classical education is so effective, because it grounds students in a thorough knowledge of history, equips them to respond to history when it's twisted into a secular morality tale. So, let's take a break, right?
Yeah.